Getcha, getcha, getcha.
Getcha Moving Monday!
I'm Ryan Kuhlman of the Broward and the Miami-Dade Real Estate Investors Associations, also known as the BREIA MC, coming to you from the BREIA and MD-REIA headquarters.
Hey guys, welcome back. It's another episode of Get You Moving Monday. So today, let's get you moving. Now before I get you moving, it's been a little while since I told a joke. I have a clean one for you that I heard this weekend, so I'm going to share it with you guys. So a little boy goes to his dad and he says, Daddy, he says, how did we get here? Where do people come from? And so his dad says, well, son, there was Adam and Eve, a man and a woman, and they had babies, and those babies grew up to become adults, and those adults had babies, and so on. So the little boy then later goes to his mother and asks her the same question. He says, Mommy, he says, where do we come from? Where do people come from? And she said, well, son, first there were monkeys, and those monkeys evolved into human beings, and that's how we're here. So the little boy is really confused now, and he goes back to his dad and he says, Dad, he says, you lied to me. He said, Mommy said that we came from monkeys. And the dad says, no, son, your mom was talking about her side of the family. All right, so enough with evolution. Let's get back to real estate. The subject's come up a few times in the last couple weeks on the topic of seller financing. When is seller financing useful? How can we do seller financing techniques or structure deals using seller financing? We used to do a lot of seller financing back in the day, but now as the market has crashed and we deal with a lot of distressed properties that are facing a foreclosure, seller financing is not as useful as it used to be. However, there still are some deals out there that you can structure seller financing, and I'm going to talk about those types of deals, what advantages they are to the buyer and seller, and what types of properties would mostly apply to seller financing techniques. Okay, so first, what exactly is seller financing? So in basic form, an owner of a property who owns it free and clear, they're going to act as the bank. The buyer, instead of going to Bank of America and getting a loan, is just going to use the equity in that property from the seller to create a note and mortgage, and the seller is going to act as the bank. Right? So since the property is owned free and clear, the seller has the ability to do that. As long as the seller doesn't want all of their money in one chunk, if they're okay with taking payments and acting as the bank over the next 10, 20, 30 years, however long that mortgage and note is, then the advantage to the seller is that they're going to make a lot more profits on that property than they would if they just simply sold it to either a cash buyer or someone coming in with financing or a mortgage from a bank or another source. So if you think about it, there's what's called a truth in lending statement when someone buys a home. And what the truth in lending statement does is it shows you over the next 20 years that you're going to be making payments, including your interest on that property. If you bought a property for $250,000 in 20 years, you'd probably end up paying about $500,000 or $600,000 in total for that property. Okay, so the advantage to a seller is that they're going to make more money, but it's just over a longer period of time. So that in basic form is what seller financing is. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple different scenarios with seller financing and the different types of deals that you can structure around seller financing. First, the most basic form is if I'm a retail buyer and I want to buy this house, but let's say that either A, I don't want to get a loan from a bank, or maybe I can't qualify for a loan of the bank. So if the seller is going to be willing to do seller financing, I don't need to worry about qualifying as long as I put a down payment that we agree on. Let's say I put 10% down, and then I'm making payments, and the interest rate, if I was going to get an interest rate from a bank at say 5%, then if that's what the seller financing is willing to do, a lot of times seller financing is usually going to be a little bit higher percentage rates than what the bank is, because if you think about it, Bank of America having millions and millions of mortgages in place make a lot more money regardless of the fact that their interest rates are going to be lower than what you would get if you were doing seller financing, because that seller generally only has that one property that they're selling, so they want to have a decent interest rate that they're making off their money. So that's the first most basic form, is where a retail buyer comes in, maybe they can't qualify for financing, and then the seller is going to offer a note and mortgage, which he's going to hold, right? And they're going to move into the property, and then they're going to be making payments with interest to the seller. Now, let's talk about some other scenarios that apply a little bit more to what we do in the world of wholesaling or rehabbing, okay? if we're wholesaling a property, there's really not an advantage or a scenario that we can create with seller financing, because we're really not trying to hold a mortgage and a note. We're not holding the property for any real period of time. We're flipping the property same day, simultaneous closing, okay? But let's say that we're profiling that property to do a rehab on the property. And let's say the property rehab is going to take 6 months, and then it might take us another 6 months to sell the property. Let's say that we're doing, $1 million property. So the way the seller financing would work is that while I'm fixing up the property, instead of me having to purchase the property and then do the rehab, let's say that this is a $500,000 house, okay, $500,000. So for me to put that money up and then put the money into the rehab is having to come up with a lot of cash. But let's say that you don't have the $500,000 to come up with, to purchase the actual property, and then have an additional $100,000. Let's say the rehab's going to be $100,000, the additional $100,000 to fix the property up. So the way that you can structure this is you can go to the seller and say, look, I know that I told you I'm paying $500,000, $500,000 for your property. How would you like to get $540,000 for your property, or $520,000 for your property? However the numbers work out at the end of the day. So the seller says, tell me how. So basically the way that would work is that the seller now is going to carry a note. He's going to require, if he's smart, for you to put some type of down payment down on the property, okay? And then he's going to allow you to fix the property up, rehab the property, while you're making the monthly payments to him as if you own the property. The advantage in that situation, obviously to me as the investor, is that I don't have to come up with the $500,000 and all of the rehab money as well. Let's say I only had to come up with 10%. So if I came up with 10% down payment and gave that $50,000 to the seller, and then let's say over the next year I'm making $5,000 in monthly payments. That's $110,000. Then I'm putting $100,000 into the property. So $210,000 is what I have to come up with, instead of me putting $500,000 to purchase the property, plus my closing costs and whatever else, and then the $100,000 on top of that. That's over $600,000. Okay, so in the scenario of using seller financing, I only need to come up with a third of the cash in order to still do the deal. And at the end, when I actually sell the property as a rehab property to my end buyer, I just cash out whatever the note mortgage was for, the $500,000 plus the interest. I just cash the seller out at that time, and instead of his $500,000, he's going to actually get a little bit more than that. Now, let's talk about the risk factors on seller financing. Okay, so the risk for the seller is very minimal in seller financing. A lot of times when a seller hears, seller financing, would you agree to do seller financing? A lot of times if they don't understand it, they freak out. They're like, what do you mean seller financing? It to them sometimes sounds like a lose-lose situation, when actually it is a win-win situation for them. Allow me to explain. So, if in both scenarios, in two different scenarios, if me as the buyer, if I actually made my payments to the seller, my down payment and my monthly payments with interest, I sold the house and I cashed them out in a year, that is actually the worst case scenario for the seller. Yes, we did everything that we agreed upon. I made all my payments. The seller walked with, say, 520, 530, 550, whatever the numbers worked out at the end of the day, walked with more money than he wanted to. But for the seller, that's his worst case scenario. The seller's best case scenario is if I default. Let's say I get hit by a bus, and after 6 months, I've already fixed up the property, I've already rehabbed the property, right? I've already put $100,000 in this property, and I've made 6 months worth of payments. That means that the seller now gets to take the property back. He has an improved property with $100,000 in it and $30,000 worth of payments plus a $50,000 down payment. In that second scenario, the seller, by me defaulting, not only gets to make the extra money, the $50,000 down payment, which was the 10% initial down payment, the $30,000 in payments that I made monthly, plus the $100,000 into his property. Now he gets to take the property back and he can resell it to someone else, and obviously he's going to be able to sell it for a lot more because the improvements have already been made. That's the best case scenario for seller financing. So when you guys are out there negotiating a seller financing situation, you can basically educate your seller to let them know, hey, listen, guy, the worst thing for me to do would be default on the loan, which is actually the best thing for you to do. So the security in seller financing for the seller is very high. So it shouldn't be an issue for them as long as they're not trying to get their payment right up front. Maybe if they have to relocate, like we had an actual property this weekend that I was talking to one of my students about. And she said, well, can we do seller financing? The house doesn't need a whole lot of work. And it's a $400,000 house that we're going to be selling for probably $500,000. And she said, well, can we maybe just do seller financing? Even though the seller still has a mortgage on the property, they would continue to make the payments. We would put money into the property, fix the property up, and then we sell it retail. Now in that scenario, even though it's not free and clear, it technically still is seller financing, even if they have a mortgage on it. She has a very small mortgage on it. And in that type of situation, sometimes we could even agree to go ahead and pay off the small mortgage, but the remainder amount, let's say her mortgage I think is $120,000, so it's a $400,000 home. So that means she'd be giving us seller financing on $280,000, okay? But the problem is in this scenario is that the seller, she wants to relocate and she needs her property paid off and she needs the additional $280,000 to buy the new property that she's moving into. So in that type of scenario, the seller financing wouldn't work. So the only way your seller financing deals are going to be able to be structured is if the seller will wait the time and can take the time to just get payments and wait on getting the full amount, okay? If they don't need the money right away to buy another property, especially if it's just an investment property for them, tired of being a landlord property, then if they don't need the money right away, then you can do the seller financing. Okay, so one last scenario is that, let's say that this is tired of being a landlord property, okay? And so what, in that scenario, instead of going in and rehabbing it and finding the retail buyer, what you would do is you would go in, fix the property up. Let's say that the seller, even though he owns it free and clear, he doesn't have the money to do some simple repairs that the property needs. Maybe it needs a new AC, it needs painted, and there's a water leak in one of the bathrooms, okay? So let's say that it's gonna take, $20,000 to fix all that. And you go to the seller and say, look, instead of me buying the property from you, wholesaling it, which you could do, or me buying it, fixing it up, and then selling it as a rental ready property, which you could do as well, why don't we do a seller financing? So that way you go in, fix the property up, you could even get a renter in place and then sell the property to another investor, either as a performing property or once you have done, completed improving the property, then you can sell the property to an end investor who's going to get their own renter into the property. So that's kind of another scenario. It's pretty much the same thing as doing a rehab. It's just the different stages of whether you get the property, completely ready for a renter and then sell it to an investor before you get a renter inside, or if you get a renter inside and get it performing. That is actually kind of a niche that I know a lot of investors around the country do, is where they'll get properties performing and then they'll sell them to, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who aren't necessarily investors, but there's always people that are looking for ways of making additional income. So a lot of times, if they don't have the knowledge and experience, if you get a property performing and say, look, I've got a 12-month lease, this person has good credit, they have a good rental history, they've got first, last, and security, the property is good to go, it's got the new AC, the roof is good, there's nothing that's going to need to be really fixed, I've already got it performing, it's at a 10% cap rate if I sell the property to you at $200,000. And let's say that you only bought it for $120,000, you're going to make that additional income. So that's something also to think about, but that's another way that seller financing applies. And now you know what time it is. Announcements. Okay, so the only real announcement that I have for today's episode is for my students. So for all of my BREIA and MDREIA mentoring students, don't forget February the 20th, right here at the BREIA headquarters, we're having the student support class, which is going to be role-playing and door knocking. For those of you that are wanting to get into real estate, or if you haven't joined our mentoring program, our support classes are every 2 weeks that we do for our students. And the role playing and door knocking is kind of they have a love-hate relationship with that one. It helps them a lot, but it also kind of puts them on the spot as well. What we actually do is we create different scenarios of homeowners within the offices here in our headquarters, and the students actually go up and knock on the door as if they're going to knock on a door of a pre-foreclosed property, someone that's in pre-foreclosure. And whether it's with equity or without equity, or maybe we do probates, but we do these role-playing exercises so they can practice knocking on that door, and then myself or sometimes an advanced student, we're on the other side and we're actually acting as the homeowner. So in some of those scenarios, we'll try to give them some rebuttals, so that way they can try to come up with the remedy of how to deal with certain rebuttals that homeowners make, like I have an attorney, I don't need your help, I'm not selling my house, like all these kinds of things. So that's what we do in our role-playing class, is to help students perfect their door knocking techniques. So I will see all of my students there February the 20th. All right, boys and girls, well, that's all the time that we have for today's episode. I hope that you guys learned a little bit about seller financing. Maybe you can structure your next deal and make it a win-win for you and the seller. Just remember, in seller financing, if they need their cash right away, you're not going to be able to structure it that way. So all of our upcoming events are on BREIA.com and MiamiDadeREIA.org. You can always go to upcoming events and even register for our events on our websites. As always, our BREIA meetings are the first Wednesday of every month, and then that next day, that Thursday, is going to be the MD REIA meeting. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. I've seen we get new subscribers every single week. I really appreciate you guys' support and following us. We've now started releasing the rehab episodes, so hopefully you guys are enjoying those as well. Give us a like on Facebook, and as I say, in between this time and the next time that we see each other, remember, every day is a new opportunity for your success.